prepared remarks, if that's okay, that I'd like to just run through to start, and then I think we can get to questions if that sounds good. Obviously I've been on the road a lot and talking with a lot of Iowans, so that has really driven the work that I am doing here in Washington, D.C. on behalf of Iowans, and specifically on behalf of those in Dubuque and Dubuque County. I am proud to serve on the House Budget Committee and the House Appropriations Committee. In these roles, I, of course, have a pretty unique opportunity to provide input and continue to advocate for Iowans throughout the entire government funding process. I'm only one of 2 House freshmen to have been appointed to the House Appropriations Committee this Congress, and the first from Iowa's 1st district to be on the committee. So I'm very excited to serve there and continue to deliver for the district through that role. When I ran to represent Northeast Iowa specifically, I promised to be accessible and transparent to those I serve. I promised to stand up for rural Iowa and be a voice. I promised also to work to help keep our communities safe and secure. And I promised to stand up for our working families and work to make sure that the money that they send to the federal government is spent wisely. Additionally, I did promise as well to find common ground wherever possible to deliver for the district without compromising on the principles that I share with so many Iowans I represent and continue to hear about on the road. I believe I have delivered on those promises, and I believe it's why I will earn another term here in Washington, D.C., representing Iowans. Unfortunately, what we've seen out here in Washington, D.C. is one-party rule that has created a series of crises for Iowa and for our nation. We have record high inflation. We have relinquished our energy independence. We have a border crisis that continues to surge out of control. We are seeing crime spiking across the country. I see that there is a competency and accountability crisis in the White House, and that is hurting Iowans. And I think the only way forward out of this is balance and continued bipartisanship. I have worked to, of course, be a check on the Biden administration while still working to find common ground wherever I can with my colleagues here, fiercely advocating for our local priorities. So I wanted to run through a couple of the Dubuque-specific efforts today. My team and I are absolutely dedicated to hearing from folks in Dubuque and the county. So whether it's at one of our 20 county tour stops, at a town hall meeting, or by just staying in regular contact with local officials and stakeholders, I'm regularly on the phone calling folks. And last year, I, of course, want to highlight the proposal from the Office of Management and Budget that threatened Dubuque's status as a metropolitan statistical area. That would have negatively impacted not only the city of Dubuque, but the county's ability to receive federal dollars, of course, those critical resources and additional economic development opportunities. So I did everything in my power to oppose that effort on behalf of the city of Dubuque. I spoke with President Biden's OMB director, Shalonda Young, several times specifically about this. I spoke with the White House directly, signed on to letters to the administration, and additionally, I also co-sponsored legislation to stop the proposal from going forward. So I raised it as a key issue right off the bat. When the agency came before us as the Appropriations Committee, they were coming to ask for their funding. I highlighted this issue for them. And as you all know, we were successful in our efforts. Dubuque was able to keep its status as a metropolitan statistical area. So very proud of that accomplishment. Another issue I want to just talk about right off the bat, most recently, I'm sure you all know, American pulled service for air out of Dubuque. We have been working on both short-term and long-term solutions since the day that announcement was made. Our team has reached out to American Airlines. I actually connected Mayor Kavanaugh directly with American last week and some other city officials as well, the airport director. So we are continuing to help foster that conversation and leaving no stone unturned when it comes to mitigating the damage that this will cause. So continues to be a top priority for me and for our office. I think it goes without saying that these priorities are my priorities. I also worked with the city of Dubuque and Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg to help secure $5 million to upgrade the Port of Dubuque. As member of the House Appropriations Committee, I was also able to secure funding for key projects in our appropriations legislation that I supported. So that included, of course, the funding for the Chaplain Schmidt Island Trail connection, as well as $45 million for the Navigation and Ecosystem Sustainability Program along the Upper Mississippi. I've had a chance to visit the lock and dam system, both in Dubuque and in Guttenberg. I know that this funding is absolutely critical for our lock and dam system, and I look forward to working with the Army Corps to help make sure that those resources continue to make their way up through the river into our area and our region. Obviously, a lot of those projects were specific to Dubuque, but was also able to secure funding to expand a child care center in Decorah, finish construction on a firehouse in Protivin, make some progress on the Tower Terrace Road project in Lynn County, and expand affordable housing in Jones County, among other important community investments. So those are issues that I prioritize because I heard from my constituents that those were important. I will continue working to bring those taxpayer dollars home to be reinvested in our communities. Big cities like San Francisco and New York hire grant writers who we know have a specific fluency, I guess you'd call it, in Washington, D.C. bureaucratic policies. So they have worked very hard, obviously, to be able to bring dollars back to their areas. I'm doing everything I can as Iowans' voice to ensure Iowans' tax dollars come back home. I know Iowa families know the value of a dollar. They sit around their kitchen tables. They have to make a budget that they stick to. And it's very clear that mindset does not exist in Washington, D.C. right now. So I'm doing everything I can, even in my position from the minority, to ensure that working families in Iowa are not continuing to pay for policies they don't support, and that the government doesn't continue to spend and spend and spend out of control. So on that note, I have pushed back and voted against wasteful spending that I see as being disrespectful to families who work hard to put food on the table and pay their bills. I do believe it's your money, not the government's money. And that's why I also recently introduced legislation to expand the child tax credit with a work requirement, so working parents can keep more of their own money to provide for their families. Safety and security for Iowa families is a top priority for me, as is ensuring that our law enforcement officers have what they need to keep our communities safe, both in Iowa and at the southern border. To me, the biggest threat to security right now is the crisis at our southern border. I am very concerned about the dangerous drugs, potentially dangerous people that are continuing to come into our country. We have seen our law enforcement at the border apprehend gang members, MS-13, sex offenders, people on the watch list, and that's just the ones that they have caught. I regularly communicate with our Iowa law enforcement officers, Republicans and Democrats, the sheriffs. I talk to all of them on a really regular basis, and I'm talking with a lot of our police chiefs. They've all told me and echoed the same challenges. They continue to see increased fentanyl and meth pouring into our communities from the southern border. So I've put forward several legislative solutions to address this crisis, calling on the administration to return to policies that secured our border rather than incentivizing illegal immigration. I will continue to do so and hold them accountable for what I see as a massive security threat and a growing humanitarian crisis they are creating. Additionally, I believe our law enforcement officers do deserve our support. I'll always look for legislative and community-oriented priorities to help support our police. Continues to be a priority, especially while some push anti-police rhetoric here in Washington. I also mentioned my commitment to rural America, continuing to be a voice for our agriculture community and advocate for our rural economy is critical. My goal is to make sure that people in rural areas have the same access to goods and services that those in urban areas do, the same quality of life, the same access to healthcare and opportunities to be successful. So I have done a lot of work in this space to improve access to maternal care for women in rural communities. Some women I know, I've talked to them, they have to drive more than an hour to see their OBGYN. So I've helped introduce legislation to expand access to midwifery services, to increase access to freestanding birthing centers, and to work to help prevent stillbirths through education. I've also introduced legislation to ensure that adult women can access safe, FDA-approved regular birth control pills over the counter at their local pharmacy. I see this as especially critical for women in rural communities and a common sense policy that I believe is long overdue. And finally, when it comes to one of my promises, which was to be accessible and transparent, I hold a press call every single week where members of the Iowa media can get on and ask me any question that's on their mind. I've also held a town hall in every county of Iowa's 1st District. I take unfiltered questions from folks about issues that they care about. And then additionally, I've also held 14 virtual town halls to connect with constituents while I'm out in Washington, D.C. So I have had 34 town halls total. I've completed 7 20 county tours. All of those tour stops are open to the media, so completely transparent there about our discussions and what we're hearing and seeing. So Iowans will always know where I stand on issues and why. If we disagree, which I know sometimes we do, I always say try to change my mind, but let's have that conversation in a respectful way. And again, I believe elected officials should be accountable to those that they represent. So the truth, after 2 years of what we've seen, we cannot afford another 2 years that look like the last 2. Iowans literally can't afford it. I am trying to make sure that DC functions more like Iowa, not the other way around. I'm very proud, again, of what we've accomplished so far, especially serving in the minority here in Washington, but we do have more to do, and that is why I'm running to continue to serve Iowans. So thank you for the opportunity to meet with you all today and to provide a little bit of an update on my work so far. I look forward to our conversation today, and my team will also be sharing with you another document that runs through a lot of our legislative accomplishments and work. So with that, happy to take your questions.
Okay, great. That's a good recap. Want to dig into some of those issues specifically. I guess just kind of to start off, I'm curious about, you mentioned a lot of things that you introduced or legislation that you advocated for. How much of how many, I guess, of those pieces of legislation would you say you worked with and partnered with somebody on the other side of the aisle?
Yeah. Well, out of more than 300 pieces of legislation that I've introduced, more than half of them are bipartisan. My first bill that was actually signed into law is a bipartisan bill that I was the lead Republican on, and Congresswoman Axney from Des Moines was the lead Democrat on. It was the Sergeant Ketchum Rural Veterans Mental Health Act, which is now law. And so there are many opportunities for things to transcend politics here in Washington, D.C. They may not always make the top headlines, but I think there are a number of those that I would highlight. Specifically, that one dealing with our veterans, which I think things should transcend politics there. Another bill that we've passed through the House, and I was one of only 7 Republicans to vote and buck my own party on, but we had a piece of legislation, a package that will help support our renewable fuels industry in Iowa and Iowa agriculture. Republican leadership was whipping against that bill. I supported it because it was the right piece of legislation to do. It's currently in the Senate, but I think that speaks to my willingness to not only work across the aisle to get legislation across the finish line, but stand up for what I, again, promised to do, which was fight for taxpayers, for rural America, and again, those other priorities that I mentioned.
I'm sorry, I missed the legislation would do what exactly?
The package that we passed.
Yeah, the one that you said you were one of 7 Republicans to support.
Right. So it was a package specifically to support our biofuels industry. So E15 also included my piece of legislation, the Precise Act, which is about precision agriculture and opening up programs that farmers already know and trust, like CSP and EQIP, to be able to use those dollars to make investments in precision agriculture equipment. So those were included in that package of bills. Again, I'm very proud to have supported that because that was the right thing for Iowa, and that's what my job is to do the right thing for Iowa.
And when you talked about introducing legislation around the immigration issue and border security, is a component of that a pathway to citizenship, and kind of how do you think, how do you come down on trying to have immigration be some sort of a response to our need for workers? Can you connect those things?
Absolutely. Well, the number one thing that I hear from employers when I travel through the district and job creators is that they have more jobs than they have people. They've increased wages. They've tried to be as competitive as possible, but we do need people in this country, and we do need legal immigration to this country. And that is something I absolutely continue to support. I've supported amendments in the appropriations process that would make it easier for workers who come here on guest worker programs to return to our country more easily. It's very clear that our legal immigration system has challenges and is overwhelmed. But what is very clear to me right now is that our illegal immigration is being incentivized over the process of law and order that we have in this country. So when I look at how we need to solve these problems. It's why I've introduced several pieces of legislation to tackle specifically the border security angle, because I think that comes first. We cannot continue to have this spigot that's on at our southern border, because it is unsustainable, it's unsafe, and it's not right. I've met with many immigrants in our community who, have been in line, who have gone through the process the right way, and they feel it's a slap in the face for the Biden administration to be turning a blind eye to what's happening at our southern border. So my policies have supported securing our southern border, giving CBP and ICE the resources that they need to make sure that they can do their job and enforce our immigration laws, including Title 42. I've stood up for taxpayers to make sure taxpayer dollars are not being used to fly illegal immigrants into our country. But again, this is about making sure we have a conversation about legal immigration reform. When I look at our guest worker programs, I think there is some expansion needed, because we want to incentivize people to come here the right way. So that's what I'm looking at working on, and I'm hopeful we'll be able to find a balance in the next Congress. But again, from Iowans, what I'm hearing about is not only do we have a missed opportunity for workforce, but they're very concerned about the security aspects of an unsecure southern border.
And can you walk us through some of there have been some big Biden administration legislation that passed, and I know a lot of those bills had multiple things attached, within, and maybe some of which you agreed and some you didn't, and ultimately kind of walk us through why you cast the vote you did on some of those big measures, what it was specifically you opposed.
Yeah. So my number one job, as I mentioned, is to stand up for taxpayers. And unfortunately, Iowans cannot afford another 2 years of this kind of spending. It's very clear President Biden and Speaker Pelosi spent the last 20 months spending and spending and spending, and it led to record high inflation in this country, the highest in my lifetime. And that's wrong. And I'm hearing from Iowans that that's wrong. So it started out last March with $1.9 trillion in spending masquerading as COVID relief. A small portion, less than 10% of that bill, actually went to public health measures to help combat COVID. And so I thought that was wrong, first and foremost. It was a giant spending package, and it should have been marketed as such. We called out the Democrats on their spending, specifically when I serve as a member of the House Budget and Appropriations Committee. We said, hey, if you spend this much money and insert this much capital into the U.S. economy, it is going to trigger rampant inflation. They denied that inflation was existing. They called it transitory. So I voted no against that package. That included a number of provisions that I saw as being harmful to Iowans with that excessive spending, including taxpayer-funded checks going to prisoners, federal prisoners like Larry Nassar, who abused our U.S. gymnastics team members, and the Boston Marathon bomber, the Charleston church shooter. All of those people received checks in the policy that the Democrats continue to push forward. Also included in that package was a provision that they snuck in about 8 hours before debate closed that started the process of snooping on Americans' bank accounts. It started with that $600 provision. Again, sounded the alarm on that, and proud to have led against that intrusion into taxpayers' bank accounts. So that's the start. We continued to see them push forward a large social spending package last year, filled with, again, massive amounts of government spending, massive tax increases on hardworking Americans in a time when we were already seeing rampant inflation. So when those bills were packaged together on the House floor, I voted no, because, again, this is about respecting taxpayers. We continued to sound the alarm on that massive overspending. Iowans want targeted investments, and that's what they've told me, and that's what I've delivered on. The Democrats and the DC way, we should not be doubling down on that, because that's wrong. We continue to see them push forward with those bills this year, a spending package as recent as August. On the day when we see inflation hit 8.3%, they're on the White House lawn celebrating the Inflation Reduction Act, which is not going to reduce inflation. In fact, we know it will raise taxes and increase audits on hardworking Americans making less than $400,000 a year. Adding 87,000 new IRS agents during a time when we're seeing record inflation seems out of touch to me. And I believe everyone should pay the taxes that they owe, but this is very clear that they want to weaponize the IRS and continue to raise taxes and expand government to do it. So that's some of the reasons why I have opposed pieces of legislation that have been brought to the floor over the last year. again, my job is to make the best deal for Iowans possible. It's why I supported the appropriations bills through that process. I negotiated, we came to the table. I was able to get Iowans' priorities included. It may not have been the bill that we would have written, but in the end, I supported it because ultimately it had a good respect for taxpayers, targeted investments, and I think funded our government in a reasonably responsible way. So that is why I have voted the way I have on many of those packages over the last 20 months.
And our newspaper and others sort of tagged you about the infrastructure bill and kind of taking a victory lap on that, on something that we said, you voted against it. So tell us, and I know I talked with your staffers about that and follow up. So, but for the benefit of everybody, kind of tell us what you're thinking on that vote and the aftermath.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what we saw again was the spending bills that were directly tied together. I've made very clear my position on why I voted no on the excessive spending that was happening last year. But the bills passed. And I think Iowans would be upset if I didn't stand up for Iowa and try to get as many federal dollars that are being spent back to Iowa. I may not have agreed with the original bill, but it is my job to go to bat for Iowans and make sure as many of those taxpayer dollars are coming back as possible. So that's why I worked across the river and across the aisle to try to come up with a solution that would fund a priority of mine that existed before that infrastructure vote, which was the lock and dam system. I've heard from many of my constituents who know that they need that lock and dam system to be viable, to get their products and services to market. So that was a priority for me, and I continued to support that. Was proud to have fought for that and secured additional dollars to come back to help fund that project. And again, that's something that, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I also was able to secure nearly $50 million through the appropriations process. And I don't think we're done. So I think that's something that I will continue to support and fight for, to make sure we're making those targeted investments in infrastructure. And I'm going to fight like hell to make sure that those resources are not being diverted to states like California or New York, where they may have more members. So I'm going to be a loud voice to make sure that continues to happen.
So just so I'm sure I understood that. So you we're working on the lock and dam piece of it. And then that work kind of got included into the infrastructure bill. So your point in kind of touting that was the work done on the front end, or?
Well, it's absolutely been a priority of mine. And so I think it's critical to continue to support our lock and dam system. So again, rather than see those resources go to fund yet another subway tunnel in Speaker Pelosi's district or another project in New York, I want to make sure that I'm fighting for Iowa's values and what they've told me is important, which is making sure that our lock and dam system and the long-term health of the Mississippi River continues to be a priority. So that is something, again, that I didn't agree with the passage of the bill. I thought it was the wrong time to be spending that much money. But if that money is going to be spent, I'm going to work my tail off to make sure that that money is going to be spent in Iowa and benefit Iowans.
Thanks. Okay. Let some of my colleagues jump in here.
I'll get in here. Looking at kind of the current state of things in DC, and I think we can all agree that there's a lot of folks here who look at how things are going out there and think it's kind of a mess. So you're running for re-election. How do we change the way things operate in DC? How do we get past the partisanship? How do we get to where it seems like we're all kind of, collectively moving in the same direction?
Yeah, well, I think that we've seen a turn away from that bipartisanship under Speaker Pelosi and President Biden in the last 20 months. Again, I've highlighted many of the bills that I've introduced that we have found common ground on, and I know that there is a great opportunity to do that. But we have to have regular order, and I think that's absolutely critical. The budget process, which I'm very passionate about, is broken. Iowans expect Washington, D.C. to function more like they have to, where they're spending within their means and setting a budget that they stick to. So the first step, I think, is making sure that the budget committee and the appropriations process follows regular order. That's Congress's bare minimum responsibility, is to come up with those appropriations bills and get those across the finish line. So I think that's absolutely critical. Transparency and accountability are also important. I hear from Iowans every day that they want transparency in not only their representative, but in their government. We've seen a severe lack of administration officials willing to come before us and answer our tough questions as members of Congress. That is absolutely critical because last I checked, we had a system that Congress was its own branch of government. The executive branch was a branch and the judicial branch was a branch. So making sure that that accountability is restored is important to Iowans, and that's something I will continue to push for. But again, I think the only way out of the current situation that we're in is bipartisanship and common sense policies that will help us to do that. Republicans have launched our Commitment to America. I would encourage everybody to check that out. I served on the Jobs and Economy Task Force, where we worked on policies that we think will help make for a strong country. Several of my provisions are included, including one that will help make things more flexible for employers so they can offer additional workforce training. Prioritizing short-term Pell opportunities at our community colleges. Again, we need to make sure we're empowering workers, empowering working families, and fighting for those values that will keep our country great. And unfortunately, what we've seen is, again, a toxic environment here in Washington, D.C. because of the leadership of Speaker Pelosi.
So as a follow-up question on the Commitment to America, as I understand it at this point, it's really philosophical and not deep on details. Would that be a correct assessment?
No, we actually have individual policies that we can get you a link to the page that includes those. Happy to follow up with you on that link. But we have provisions under each of those that will help execute each of those value statements that we've put out. So happy to get you additional details on that.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'll continue if I may. Obviously, one of the hottest points of discussion, I think in Iowa, there's a number of things, and you've touched on those, inflation and the border. But a hot issue in Iowa, across the country, and a very dividing topic is a woman's right to choose. And you and your opponent are on opposite ends of the spectrum on that. And I'd like to have you provide some insight on your thought process.
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I am pro-life. I will continue to champion pro-life policies here in Washington, D.C., including that taxpayer dollars do not fund abortion, elective abortion. I think also improving access to maternal care, especially for moms in rural areas, is pro-life. Supporting expecting mothers during their pregnancy once their baby is born is pro-life. And standing against what I see as a radical abortion agenda from the Democrats. And you're right, this is a contrast between myself and my opponent. Unfortunately, what we've seen is Democrats in Congress have continued to take the extreme position on abortion and support abortion on demand until birth. So I think it's really important to be offering policies that help support families. It's why just a few weeks ago, or probably last week, I introduced the Providing for Life Act, which is a comprehensive plan of pro-life policies to enhance, again, the child tax credit, support moms no matter what their socioeconomic status is, help engage fathers in the process, support pregnant students. It runs the gamut, and I think it's a comprehensive bill that will help Iowans and Americans keep more of their own money while still supporting life and moms and babies and encouraging that. So I've also worked to help with other policies that I see as being pro-life, specifically expanding access to maternal care. I mentioned my work in the district we have 6 counties that are considered maternal health care deserts. So Midwives for Moms Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation that I've introduced that I see as being, again, very pro-life to help increase the number of midwives practicing. I worked across the aisle with Alma Adams from North Carolina on a bill to help make sure some of those block grant dollars that are going to our states can help be used to empower and educate women to prevent stillbirths. And I've also worked to make sure that we're helping support families that do experience that tragedy of a stillbirth with access to FMLA leave and family leave. The other provision I would include in that package, Providing for Life, it does enable people to be able to use dollars from their Social Security benefits to take take leave to be able to support their family during that time. So I think being pro-life means to me that whole comprehensive agenda. And I think that's what I will continue to support here in Washington, D.C., because that's what I continue to hear from Iowans, is that they want a champion for that full scope pro-life agenda.
So I'd like to follow up on that question real quick, our Representative Hinson. I think most polls in this country, and also even in Iowa, show that a lot of people are not completely against abortion and not completely for, that they're somewhere in between, and either up to a certain point under certain circumstances. Just want to be clear, most people in the polls that I've seen show that people are supportive in the case of rape, incest, or life of the mother. Others are in favor of having access up to a certain point before the fetus is viable. I guess I would just say is on the spectrum from none at any at all to complete access, where do you fall in that spectrum specifically?
Yeah. Well, I'm pro-life, and I will continue again to support pro-life policies that help save lives here in Washington, D.C. It's why you see my record. I've supported a 20-week abortion ban in Iowa because I think that is helping to save lives. In Iowa, I actually had a constituent come up and tell me they were able to adopt a child because of that bill. My opponent voted against that. I voted for a heartbeat bill with exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. I heard from my constituents that that's important to do, so I will continue to support what I'm hearing from my constituents. But again, what I hear is that Iowans oppose the extreme position of allowing abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy, and so do I. And I will continue to stand up for life, continue to support expecting moms during their pregnancies, once their baby's born. And again, I believe the Democrats have laid down their extreme agenda here in Washington, D.C., and they will continue to push that while I continue to stand up for families and taxpayers.
Thank you.
Just circling back a little bit on the talk about spending and inflation. Obviously, that's a huge issue that lots of folks are talking about. One kind of question I have. So we have a lot of readers who aren't economics experts. Where does, when you see the inflation issues that the U.S. is battling, but then you see a number of countries across the world battling similar inflation and economic issues. How much, when you're seeing it happen elsewhere, how much is what is being done in the U.S. causing what's happening in the U.S.? It's kind of confusing to folks.
Yeah, well, I go back to what I said about that first vote back in March, the $1.9 trillion plan. Economists all said that if we continued to spend and spend and spend, it would create rampant inflation. Shalonda Young, the director of Office and Management and Budget, came before the Budget Committee and said inflation was transitory. They're just not living in reality. And again, they continue to spend and spend and spend. Just this year, during the budget process, she came before us again and said that inflation projections for the next 10 years were 2.3%. I don't know what world they're living in, but that's not reality. And the Biden-Pelosi economy is not working for our working families. I don't think there is just one silver bullet to undo all the severe damage that they've done to our economy, but I will continue to work on common sense solutions that I see as helping to get our economy back on track, helping people keep more of their hard-earned paychecks. Right now, 1 in 6 people are behind on their utility bills. We're hearing 90% of people's paychecks are being used to cover expenses. That's sacrificing savings. So the solutions that I'm going to continue to support and I've worked on are helping get people off the sidelines back into the workforce. I've helped introduce some legislation to get more manufacturing back to America. One piece that I would specifically point to that I think is designed to help make sure that Congress is making responsible decisions is the Informed Law Making to Combat Inflation Act, which would actually require the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, to analyze the inflationary effects of pending legislation with a budget impact, and then provide members of Congress with that information before we vote on those bills. That's a bipartisan bill. So I've co-sponsored that with 2 Democrats and another Republican. So I see all of those policies as working together to help counter the inflation environment and lower that inflation. Again, all of the above energy strategy, we've seen an administration do everything they can to torpedo the energy industry. Energy independence is national security. It's good paying jobs. We need to help support our biofuels industry in Iowa as a part of that conversation. But what this administration has done is put up every roadblock possible to moving forward with energy independence. We want to reverse that with our policies. So again, I think that you've seen the policies of this administration and the Democrats in Congress with the spending have a direct impact on what is happening in our country. The border crisis, if we were enforcing our laws as they are written, we would have a secure border. If we had listened to the experts and if the Democrats in Congress had not pushed ahead with all of that spending, we would not be seeing the level of inflation we are seeing today. And so I think that there's a direct line and correlation between what they have done and what they have caused, between what we will do and what we're laying out, should we be able to take back the House and have a majority.
So just a follow-up on that would be, I think most of the analysis I've seen from economists talks about both energy prices being a function of refineries being shut down, the war in Ukraine, and the global oil is a global marketplace, and Russia, the war with Ukraine is having a major impact there, and also a contributing factor to inflation, as well as supply chain shortages, shortages of human resources, workers. So I guess I would say is, how would you respond to some of that economic analysis that, the inflation is not purely a legislation function or a decision on the current executive administration, but more global issues. And as Dustin pointed out, not seen uniquely to the United States, but all across the world, especially Europe.
Well, we need clean energy solutions for this country, and absolutely we should be having this conversation. But all you have to do is go back and look at the price of gas and fuel before President Biden and this administration took over. And there's your contrast right there. They directly caused the direct increase in fuel prices. And then their solution to artificially lower the cost of gas for consumers at the pump is to dip into our strategic reserve. Right now, we are seeing that reserve level at the lowest it's been in more than 35 years, which puts us at an extreme disadvantage when it comes to global security. So again, when I say energy security is national security, I mean that. And I think we are vulnerable because of the decisions that this administration has made. One of the quickest ways to lower the cost for consumers is to lower the price of gas. It's to increase production. But again, this administration has done everything possible to put roadblocks up with the permitting process and with the new leasing process. We should not be going to our foreign adversaries for more oil. We should be producing more here, while simultaneously having the conversation about how we become, greener with our solutions. And I think that those things can happen concurrently. But the number one goal I have is to make sure we're continuing to fight for American energy independence, because I see that as a national security issue, as well as an issue that will help fight inflation.
I've got a question. So a couple of themes that you've sort of hit on in your interviews. You've talked one about this idea of Washington being very partisan, which certainly is the perception among a lot of folks, and oftentimes who is being partisan depends on what your political party is. If you're one side, you think the other side. If you're another side, you think it's the other side. And so you've talked a lot about your concerns with the Biden administration and partisanship on that side. If in November, Republicans took the majority of the House or the Senate, I mean, what would you do to be a solution to that, to be someone who's bipartisan, and to not continue this sort of cycle of partisanship that we've been seeing for, it feels like a while now?
Yeah, well, I think I'm in a unique position as the only Iowan on the Appropriations Committee to do that and lead through that process. I do believe we'll have our differences and we'll fight those out. And accountability is going to be an important part of our role as appropriators to make sure they're answering questions about the use of taxpayer dollars. And I think that's important. But if there's a good process to look to, it's that appropriators are willing to work across the aisle to get the best deal for their districts. And that's exactly what I've done and what I will continue to do. And I think that more people should operate like, again, the Appropriations Committee does. A prime example, Sherry Bustos, right across the river. She's a fellow appropriator. She was the head last cycle of the DCCC, a group that came in and spent a lot of money against me on the air trying to make sure I didn't get elected. But when we both won and got back in and we were both named to the Appropriations Committee, we had coffee in her office and had a chat about our shared priorities and wanted to see those get across the finish line. I'd go back to, again, talking about the NESP program. That success is a direct result of my working with other people across the aisle to develop those relationships and that trust to make sure that we can execute and deliver for our districts. And so, and that's what I will continue to do. I believe, again, in pushing back against policies that are not right for Iowa, and I will be fierce in my opposition to those, even if they're from my own party. But I will continue to work together whenever I can to advance agendas that I think are good and execute for the Iowa people and hold taxpayers in the highest regard.
Okay, we're getting here pretty close to the end of our time. I think you mentioned about more than 300 pieces of legislation that you were able to introduce. How many of those were able to come to fruition?
Yeah, well, right now we've had the fix for the Crime Victims Fund that made it across the finish line and is law, and the Sergeant Ketchum bill is law. So those two have been actually signed. Additionally, as I would mention, the appropriations bills that I've supported were bipartisan, and those have been signed into law. So we can get you a whole list of all the bills and where they stand. Several of them have passed the House that I've co-sponsored. And so we'll continue to work through that process, and hopefully we can get some done in the next couple of weeks as we head toward the end of the fiscal year. The end of the fiscal year is tomorrow, but the end of the calendar year as well.
Okay, great. Well, we really appreciate your time, covered a lot of ground, and thank you for meeting with us today and for meeting with our reporters regularly. We appreciate that.
Well, and if there's any follow-up questions, of course, don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to get you any backup information or context information and clarification on anything that you might have a question about. Follow up.
Sounds good. Thanks very much. Good luck the rest of the way.
Thank you very much. Hang in there. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.